Yes, more pain reliever and a special combination of medical ingredients. That's the Anacin difference. So now which pain reliever?
Anacin. I'm going to get the Anacin difference.
Occasionally, we run across a story that is so unusual it seems it should be fiction. The death of Edward Nevin is such a tale. He was an immigrant whose life could be the story of every Irishman who came to these shores. Edward Nevin was a patriot, a man who worshipped freedom, and yet a man whose death, so his family says, came at the hands of the country he loved. Until recently, the death of Edward Nevin was a mystery. It involved a secret government experiment so closely guarded it would be a quarter of a century before it could be told. The year was 1950. The Cold War was at its height. That same autumn, a man named Edward Nevin, a 75-year-old Irish immigrant who had come to San Francisco in 1905 and fathered 7 children, died. Mr. Nevin had just been through successful surgery and had been released from the hospital. Then suddenly, and without explanation, he became ill and was forced to return.
I became acquainted with Mr. Nevin when his illness was obviously severe, and he came to the medical service where I was a resident, and we...
In 1950, Dr. Richard Wheat was a 28-year-old resident at Stanford University Hospital in San Francisco when he noticed that certain patients in his care were coming down with a mysterious illness. By the time the infection had run its course, 11 men had been stricken by a strange bacteria called Serratio marcescens. What puzzled Dr. Wheat was that this particular bacteria had never before been seen in his hospital or anywhere else in the San Francisco area.
Well, at first it was a curiosity, and then it became a concern that perhaps we had something going that we didn't understand or didn't know about. So with that in mind, we tried to find out where it was coming from and what had caused it, with absolutely no luck at all.
So puzzled was Dr. Wheat by the appearance of Serratio marcescens and the illness of the 11 patients that he published an account of the experience in a medical journal. 10 of the men eventually recovered from the infection, but one man did not, a man whose initials were E.N. In November of 1950, Edward Nevin died. It would be 26 years before all the circumstances surrounding his death would be known. These old home movies of Edward Nevin, taken a few years before his death, are the only remaining record of him. They reveal a vigorous, vital individual who looked and acted far younger than his age. A man who, by all rights, should have been able to resist the bacteria that appeared from nowhere to kill him. And where it came from was a mystery. We pick up the story some 3,000 miles across the country at Harvard University, where this man, Dr. Matthew Meselson, is professor of biochemistry. In 1965, Dr. Meselson's assistant had told him a story she had heard and kept secret since 1950. It concerned a U.S. Army biological warfare experiment in San Francisco, which, according to the woman's informant, had resulted in the death of a man. The experiment involved the use of live bacteria called Serratio marcescens. The woman was very nervous about telling this to Dr. Meselson.
She was frightened. She was frightened. She knew that I was then, as I have been for many years, very interested in chemical and biological defense and chemical and biological arms control, chemical and biological weapons. That's why she told me, and also because we were good friends. But she was afraid and asked me not to tell anybody. I then made a search of the medical literature to see if I could find any articles about this, because that would be rather unusual. I knew that deaths from Serratio marcescens would be considered unusual. And I found an article, and I called one of the authors, Dr. Wheat.
And what did he tell you about the death? Did he tell you that he was pretty sure that it was caused by this, or...
Well, the death itself was certainly caused by bacterial endocarditis and due to Serratio marcescens. But as to the puzzle of where the bacteria came from in that and the other cases, which all occurred within a short interval of time, he was still as mystified as before, though he still, as I recall, believed, as he had written in his paper, that there had been a common source. But what that common source might be, he had no guess at that time. Or if he did, he didn't tell me. I had a guess.
You knew about the test.
I knew about the test. And I told people in the government that this sort of thing was foolish and that it ought to be stopped, but I didn't know who the right people were to talk to, I don't think.
What Dr. Meselson also didn't know was that millions of Americans had already been used by the government as unwitting guinea pigs in more than 200 biological warfare experiments that took place between 1949 and 1968, when they were finally stopped. What was the Army trying to learn from exposing millions of Americans to what they thought was completely harmless bacteria? They say it was the only way they could find out how to cope with a real germ warfare attack should the Russians ever launch one. So 19 civilian targets were chosen to practice on. One of them was the New York City subway system. As 60 Minutes producer Harry Moses did the other day, the Army's man in New York entered the subway carrying a light bulb. Only his light bulb contained live bacteria to be used in the experiment. As the train sped through the tunnel, the man opened the door separating two of the cars, stepped into the opening, and dropped the light bulb on the tracks, releasing the bacteria. Monitoring stations set up by the Army showed that the experiment was a success. The bacteria had traveled from 14th Street all the way up to 59th Street, a distance of more than 2 miles. Similar tests were conducted at Washington's National Airport, at Greyhound bus terminals in Alaska and Hawaii, and in 2 tunnels on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. But the biggest and the most bizarre biological warfare test of all took place in September of 1950 in San Francisco, California. The object of the test, according to recently declassified Army documents, was, quote, to study the offensive possibilities of attacking a seaport city with a biological warfare aerosol generated from a ship located some distance offshore. And so, on a Navy ship, about the size and length of this one, the U.S. Army's secret testing team steamed out into the middle of San Francisco Bay. Attached to the railing on the fantail of the ship were 3 huge metal canisters containing the biological agent to be used in the experiment, a bacteria named Serratia marcescens, selected because of its supposedly benign characteristics and the bright red color it produces under laboratory analysis. At precisely 1700 hours, the testing team pointed the hoses attached to the canisters skyward, opened the valves of the nozzles, and set forth an aerosol cloud of bacteria toward its intended destination, the city of San Francisco. As the cloud made its way across the bay, 3 aircraft hovered overhead, collecting meteorological data, and 20 ground stations were obtaining figures on wind direction and velocity. While all this was happening, the Army had established 43 sampling stations at various locations throughout the Bay Area to determine how great the bacteria's penetration had been. Volunteers stood by the windows of their homes, of government office buildings, even on their rooftops. All were holding sieve-like collectors similar to this one, which would trap airborne bacteria released from the ship. After these collectors had been analyzed by the lab, the Army learned that 30 square miles, or nearly all of San Francisco, had been exposed to the bacteria. Almost 800,000 persons had breathed particles of Serratia marcescens that September day in 1950. Why then did only 11 people, one of whom died, feel the effects of the Serratia marcescens? The winds that day blew it directly over the hospital where those 11 patients were undergoing treatment that made them particularly susceptible to the infection. A common source for that infection was always suspected by Dr. Wheat, but as Dr. Messelson told us, there was no way of knowing what it was at the time. The spraying of San Francisco would remain a closely guarded secret until 1976, when an enterprising reporter found out about it, linked it to Dr. Wheat's article, and filed his story. On December 22nd, 1976, the story hit page 1 of the San Francisco Chronicle. No one would feel its impact more greatly than a young trial attorney who had been specializing in medical malpractice cases. He remembers it this way.
I take BART from my home in Berkeley to work, and I was waiting for the BART train. I was reading the paper, and I came upon a front page article which was a headline read, "Bacteriological Warfare Experiments in 1950 San Francisco." As a trial lawyer, as someone who deals with these kinds of cases, I looked at it without surprise, but with a detached sort of objective view, a professional looking at something within his field. I then discovered that the one person who died as a result of these experiments was Edward J. Nevin, a retired San Francisco pipe fitter who died in Stanford Hospital on November 1st, 1950. That was my grandfather. I was stunned, I was angry, I was hurt. The government made a decision with extremely limited thought and preparation and investigation, made a decision to expose 800,000 San Francisco citizens to bacterium, live bacterium, did not investigate the potentials for that bacterium causing disease to an adequate degree, and proceeded nevertheless to, in effect, reverse the whole process of the purpose of our military and our defense system, that is to protect the people of the United States of America. And instead, that very branch of our government attacked the people of the United States of America.
What does the Pentagon say about that? It refused our request for an interview, but maintains that any association between the bacteria that was sprayed on San Francisco with the bacteria that killed Edward Nevin is a coincidence.
Of course, it was a fascinating coincidence, if that, since the time of their experiments was on the 26th and 27th of September, and our first case came in on the 29th of September. And Mr. Nevin, our gentleman who died of the disease, first became ill with this organism on the 2nd of October. The timing of those things is awfully interesting.
Awfully interesting is not how the Nevin family would describe the relationship between the Army experiment and the death of Edward Nevin. His son is far more vehement.
Well, I can't help remembering that the enemy did not do this to those 11 people in Stanford Hospital, that it was this government that did it, and it resulted in my father's death.
It just happened to the wrong person.
Mr. Nevin's daughter.
You know, if it was somebody that wasn't a likable person or didn't do good in the world, I feel that he did good in the world. He was real proud of being an American. And you know, my mother was too. They never had any desire to go back. They wouldn't leave America. They loved it. He left a wonderful heritage to all of us. I think we're a remarkable family.
Hurrah! Timmy! Open it up, Tim.
Each Christmas is a time of reunion for the Nevin clan, and each Christmas, all 4 generations of the family gather to celebrate the season. The Nevins are there, of course, and the Carys, too. The Brays and the Gallaghers, the Donahos and the McFadens. And from the oldest to the youngest, there is a bond and a resolve and a purpose that joins everyone. For all of these people, all 65 living descendants of Edward J. Nevin have united to file suit against the Army, the Navy, the Department of Defense, and the United States of America for the wrongful death of the founder of this extended Irish-American family. And who will be arguing the case?
I'm Edward J. Nevin III, and 75 years later, I have an opportunity to present to the American people my grandfather's story for a very, very important purpose. You do not test people without them knowing it. You do not test in secrecy. You do not risk, no matter what limited risk you think you have that you're taking, without having people knowingly submit to that risk. This is a question for all of us in a democratic society. We have to know.
Because the wine remembers, the corksmith judges the quality of the cork.